of the CRS CERLAC Virtual Student Conference. The theme of this panel is Refugee Self-Representation and Agency. Thank you to everyone for being here, and thanks to our panelists. I just wanted to quickly remind everyone about our code of conduct. The link was posted in the chat, so just make sure to take a look where it outlines the expectations for the attendees and presenters. There will be a Q&A session at the end of the third presentation. And just wanted to let everyone know that the session is being recorded. And if you would like to keep your cameras off, please do so. And you are welcome to change your display name for privacy. So to start us off, I am happy to introduce Souhail, a PhD student in the Policy Studies program at Ryerson University, with a focus on migrants' well-being and policies. He will be presenting on older Syrian refugees, experiences of language barriers in post-migration and resettlement context in Canada.
Thank you, Laura. Hello, everyone, and thank you for attending this session with us. I'm very excited to join you today. First of all, let me just share my screen. So I don't have any surprises here for you or any secrets. I have just a few slides to go through, and I will be talking about the experiences of older Syrian refugees with language barriers in the post-migration and resettlement context. Before I move on, I would like to thank the organizers, Laura, Nicole, Christina, Alexandra. I saw here Brianna as well. I don't know the others, but I want to thank all of you very much for organizing this virtual meeting. My agenda, just to walk you through what I will be doing today, I will just give you a background of the different programs that we have for the resettlement of Syrian refugees. I'll give you a literature review. I'll walk you through my study purpose and research questions. I will focus, and I'd like you to focus on the theoretical framework and methodologies. I did not see that yesterday. And I will just present my results and discussion as well as my implications. So to start off, let me just give you a background of the different resettlement programs that the government of Canada has for the Syrian refugees. So we have the government assisted refugees program. There is a blended visa office referred refugees program and the privately sponsored refugees program. So as you can see, the GARs or government assisted refugees represent approximately 50 to 55% of the population. Now, let me walk you through the literature review, just so you can have an idea of how I came up with the research question. So older immigrants, especially newcomers, often lack the financial means and language barriers to support themselves and communicate with their family members and neighbors. A lack of English knowledge affects their ability to navigate the Canadian system, increase their social isolation, and decreases their employment opportunities. The language barrier prevents older immigrants and refugees, especially newcomers, from engaging with the community and participating in social events. Older immigrants, refugees, and newcomers experience social isolation and loneliness even more because of the language barrier, according to Stewart. Communication with service providers is often limited because of lack of appropriate interpretation services, according to Whelan. And the Canadian government views older immigrants as beyond their employment years as with little of economic benefits and also as a burden on the healthcare system, according to Meyer Siamyatik. All these factors can lead to a loss of their status and at the home and of course at the community levels. These factors may also create situations of elder abuse and vulnerability, in addition to mental health and mental and health problems. So looking at this literature review, I came up with the purpose to study in depth and to explore in depth all the Syrian refugees' experiences with language barriers in the post-migration and resettlement context. My research questions is what are Syrian refugees, GAR's experiences with language barriers after the resettlement in the Greater Toronto and Hamilton area. So let me focus on my theoretical approach right now. In terms of theory, I use the ecological model. So the ecological model, according to Gurugi and Khanlu, is appropriate to study the older immigrants and refugees' experiences as influenced by the micro, meso, and macro systems. To my interest, the microsystems is the immediate environment. The mesosystem consists on the relationship with the community, and the macrosystem refers to the cultural and societal dominance and practices. These systems, of course, within the ecological approach, have reciprocal relationships and therefore can provide us with an in-depth understanding of their experiences. In terms of the method that I used qualitative descriptive method because it just can describe experiences of the Syrian older refugees as outlined by the as framed by the macro, meso, and micro levels. Thor explains that descriptive finding will help close the gap, and this is my field of studies in the policy studies. So I would like to close the gap between refugees' experiences on the one hand and policymakers on the other. So I received the REB a couple of years ago. So this is a recent study, and I recruited 6 participants, 3 male and 3 females, for these interviews. In terms of the interview questions that I have were mainly broad. So experience with language learning process in Canada, experience with language barrier at the family level, at the community, and at the institutional levels. I will give you now an outline of the results throughout the three levels. So at the individual level, my participants' commitment to learn comes from their consciousness, and they all have this quality of the role that language barrier can play in shaping their experiences of resettlement in Canada. They learned how to navigate different barriers to help them navigate and accommodate their needs. Online and mixed age classes, this is just in relation to the COVID situation. It was not really appropriate for the participants' learning progress because they actually they wanted to have that interaction with teachers and students, and the desire of older Syrian refugees to take control of their daily lives gave them that hope that their settlement is not just going to end with their story of refugees. A female of 70 years old said that I want to run my own errands without asking to help from anyone. And another male said that I have 3 courses to complete. After that, I want to go to college. I don't know what I can do. My brother has a Down syndrome. I am very worried because I do have to, and most of them had this problem of having to do errands outside, having to go outside, but they had all some kind of situation at home that kept them inside as a caregiver. At the family level, so the participants depend on their children to help them communicate with the outside world. So my a participant of 84 years old said, my friends from the Arabic-speaking community don't like to go out. They have their son or daughter to drive them around. They visit each other, and that's about it. It's not motivating environment to learn faster. And they also had this problem with their children because their children learn faster. So my daughter is doing much better because she's young and she can learn faster. Also, she knew some English before coming to Canada. She speaks fluently and she just graduated from college. So that shows that they cannot really learn from their children or from their community. So let's move on to the community level now. Most of the participants had little to no contact with the community members. One of a male of 84 years old said, my neighbors told me that his son is ill. I met him a few days later. I wanted to ask him about his son's health, but I couldn't. And even if I knew what to say, I will not be able to understand his answer. That's my problem. So that shows you his daily struggle within the community. Some participants used food sharing and volunteering as a strategy. So I'm a female of 64 years old. I tried my best to make friends with locals, and so I can practice my English. One day it was Eid, I made a cake and I knocked on the apartment's door beside us. I wanted to get to know them and practice the language, but they never opened the door. Again, another participant about the experiences of how to navigate different community services. My children are not here. I won't call anyone. I will do it myself. And most of the time it goes well. This is a 70 years old female. I do not have any problems buying what I need from the grocery store. I use both debit and cash. So she felt very comfortable, and you can see the level of agency that these people have. So let me move on to the societal level. All participants mentioned that they struggle to access information because of the lack of language. They experienced anxiety when performing administrative tasks. So you can see that it's not like the same as going to the grocery store. When it comes to administrative tasks, they get scared. So making phone calls, booking an appointment with a doctor or with any other government services, that's when they become reliant on their children. They require the help of their children, settlement case managers, and interpreters to complete forms, for example, or to submit their yearly taxes. At the societal level, so when it comes to employment, participants did not find that the language helped them get securing employment in Canada. One of the participants said, I have working experience in the US because I was working for the UN. I am now still volunteering. I do my job in Canada and I have to go to do my job in Canada, I have to go through the licensing process, but it can be very costly. I did not know about the subsidy program at the time, so it was mainly a financial barrier. Now I have a feeling that it's too late. So again, in terms of the healthcare, access to healthcare services, participants except one reported some level of stress and anxiety when dealing with healthcare providers. When it comes to my diagnosis and prescriptions, this is the doctor, she calls my son over the phone to explain what medication I should be taking. And in terms of in regard to interpretation and translation services, the Arabic-speaking community speaks different dialects. They may not be able to communicate with Arabic-speaking immigrants and refugees, and this is mainly because of literacy problems. So also the Arabic language, we can look into the literacy in that level, at that level as well. My limitation was in terms of the recruitment. I couldn't find any, and I think because of the cost of living in downtown Toronto, so I had to go outside of Toronto, for example, to Mississauga or to Hamilton to find my participants. So let me give you now an idea about the discussion and of my results. I think I have 2 or 3 minutes left, right? Thank you. So let me give you just a comparison between what's in the literature and my findings. So the literature shows that the combination of financial and language barriers create a form of interdependency that keep older adults and their children in constant struggle to maintain the stability of their families. The literature also shows that communication difficulties minimize the social contact and interaction and increase social isolation and loneliness. In my study, I found that children do not have the academic credentials and Canadian experiences to help them find employment. On the one hand, their parents rely on them on a daily basis to make phone calls, to answer phone calls, to buy food, to manage their finances, book appointments, and complete their administrative tasks. All my participants except one experienced social isolation because of the lack of language proficiency. To build long-term relationships with different community members, they make tremendous effort to learn the language, such as attending classes for 4 consecutive years without interruption, driving long distances. One participant used to drive 25 kilometers just to go to a French class because he was fluent in English. and walking in hardship winter conditions. This participant of 84 years old, he had actually the TTC coming to his door to take him to school, but he refused. He wanted to walk in the winter. Again, in terms of the employment and healthcare, the literature shows that the lack of resources to acquire language proficiency and the absence of adequate programs forces immigrant women to take menial positions. My findings were in line with that, except that for me, men also took menial positions. I found that language classes did not help them with their search of employment and licensing process. They had difficulties accessing information about available and appropriate programs, such as a combination of both, like a professional and language training, and to upgrade their academic credentials. Women and men in the study prefer dealing with the Arabic-speaking healthcare professionals, mainly because of the language barrier. So finally, the application of my study. So most of my participants showed that some kind of dependency on their children, caseworkers or interpreters. However, the absence of support did not stop them from carrying on with their responsibilities with a high level of commitment and agency. I suggest creation of newcomers program that provide tailored information about available language classes, including full-time, part-time, formal and informal, academic upgrading and licensing within the first year so that they do not lose time. The newcomers outreach program to promote community engagement while learning English, intergenerational, such as tutoring within the same neighborhood. Or as one of the participants suggested, like knitting or cooking classes in an informal way. Practicing English while volunteering within the neighborhood can help reduce social isolation. So I recommend providing adults with financial support to help them cover the cost, for example, to attend informal classes. Okay, thank you very much. That's the end of my presentation.
Thank you. So we'll do a Q&A at the end of the presentations. Yeah, but thank you so much. So our next presenter is Lara. She is a PhD student in the sociology program at York University and focuses on stateless refugees and their day-to-day and long-term survival and coping strategies. She'll be presenting on Palestinian refugee youth in Jordan, negotiating poverty beyond their legal statuses.
Thank you, Laura, and hello, everyone. I'm really excited to be here. I guess I'll just jump straight into the presentation. So I'll just share my screen. Okay, can everybody see this? Okay. Right, and okay. So before I begin today, I would like to share with you basically that my interest in this research stemmed from, well, first of all, to be honest, because I hold the Palestinian cause quite close to my heart, but also because I always found the fact that it is astonishing how we see refugees, displaced groups. They literally spend their whole life trying to challenge refugees in so many different forms, and hence my interest in specifically protracted refugee situations, and specifically the longest situation among them, which is Palestinian refugees. But I particularly look at their legal statuses and what those actually mean in refugees' pursuit of durable solutions in their extended exile. Therefore, today I will talk about the research that I conducted in 2019, examining how stateless Palestinian youth in Jordan negotiate poverty and durable solutions beyond their legal status. And going beyond their legal status is a key issue here that I address in my presentation. In order to do this, I'm going to demonstrate the debates that I engaged with first, and then how I contextualized them before arriving to my research question and methodology. And finally, I will address the research findings before I conclude and share with you what I plan to move, how I plan to move forward and any future research. Now, profound scholarly work demonstrates how refugees negotiate victimizing labels and interventions that portray them as persons with compromised agency, while also recognizing their active roles in shaping their own solutions to establish prominent livelihoods in protected displacement. Thus, the two key questions here that I look at is how do we use these understandings to shift the focus from the usual state and international organization-centric solutions to refugee-led solutions? And how do we do this without homogenizing their experiences? So I address these two questions by first engaging with the multidisciplinary theoretical and empirical scholarship to conceptualize and measure agency of refugees. You know, theories like Anthony Giddens' structuration theory, for an example, but also important empirical work that scholars in displacement studies had conducted. But importantly, to explore these conceptualizations, it has to be in avenues beyond the limitations of their legal status. And why? Because legal status is a matter controlled by states and non-state entities, but not really by refugees themselves. And I expand the discussion by drawing on scholars who call for greater attention to bridging between displacement and development studies to expand the spaces within which refugees can exercise agency, especially in countries challenged by stagnating economics like Jordan. And so one pathway to bridge displacement and development is addressing poverty of refugees and how they negotiate it. And lastly, I avoid homogenizing refugees' experiences by emphasizing that I do not attempt to generate generalizable empirical findings, but rather to problematize assumptions surrounding refugees' lack of resourcefulness, and resiliency in protracted situations. So now I contextualize these debates by focusing on stateless Palestinians, but I took advantage of one fact that different groups of Palestinians have different legal statuses in Jordan, depending on when they were displaced. Some de jure stateless, those who arrived in the aftermath of the 1967 war, and others are naturalized, those who arrived in 1948. And this was a great window of opportunity to understand the impact of their different legal statuses on exercising agency and shaping livelihoods. Meaning that when I compared both groups, I managed to see what is common or similar in both groups and what is specific about the agency of stateless Palestinians. Thus, my research question interrogates how the legal status of de jure stateless Palestinian youth in Jordan informs their negotiation processes of poverty-related constraints to enhance their livelihoods. And here, negotiating for me is conceptualized through the exercise of agency. So how did I answer this question? And I think it's important here to briefly engage with you with the methodology I adopted, although this is by no means exhaustive of the very long process I undertook, but I adopted a qualitative approach through conducting mainly in-depth interviews with Palestinian youth as a main source of data. Then I focused on understanding the participants' life trajectories in education and employment through understanding how and why they make these choices and decisions. Now, to conduct this analysis, I critically adopted the analytical framework of Ruth Lister and Johnson Sumner, which was later utilized by Christina Clark-Kazaks to analyze the agency of Congolese refugee youth. Using coding as the primary data analysis technique, I deployed 3 levels of coding. The first, open coding. In the first step of this coding, I used Ruth Lister's types of agency in poverty situations: getting by, getting back at, getting out, and getting organized. And each of these forms of agency refers to different everyday or longer term strategic or personal or collective strategies to challenge poverty. And I use these forms to derive similar forms of agency from the stories participants shared with me. The Excel coding, the second, it consists of situating Lister's type of agency into Johnson Sumner's 3 well-being domains: the material, the relational, and the subjective, that they use to analyze and understand how agency exercised by poor children and young people. The material well-being domain is where agency is related to needs, resources, assets, observable outcomes. The relational one is where agency is related to connections to others through networks of support and obligation. And the subjective well-being domain relates to meanings people give to the goals they achieve and the processes they engage in. And finally, thematic coding it was aiming to compile the different forms of agency into overarching themes of agency in each well-being domain. But then the niche of my research is that I expand Jones and Sumner's analytical framework through proposing that forms of agency do not remain confined in one well-being domain. Rather, while conducting fieldwork, I realized that every form of agency in the material and the relational domain is understood in relation to the subjective meanings participants give to their lives and their surroundings. Hence, all forms of agency in the material and relational well-being domains interact with agency forms in the subjective domain to generate livelihood strategies that are subjectively meaningful for them. So I conducted each of these three layers of coding to each group alone, and then derived similarities and differences to understand what is specific exactly about statelessness in this specific context. So what is really specific about stateless Palestinian youth's agency? Now, this table that you see demonstrates findings. All themes of agency are similar or common between both groups, except number 4 in the relational domain and number 4 in the subjective domain. And I will come to this shortly, but just a quick note here that those themes that you see are projected from more than 90 forms of agency I derived from the interviews themselves. Now, 2 main livelihood strategies were generated from this process. The first livelihood strategy is capturing ontological security, and which is the outcome of the interrelation between themes of agency in the material and relational domains and the subjective meanings of certainty and social roles. And I borrow here from Anthony Giddens' conceptualization of ontological security. But for both groups, meanings of certainty, order, and safety were derived from accessing education and jobs. 2 things were striking really here for me, that both stateless and naturalized participants were educated in the UNRWA schools, the UN Agency for Palestinian Refugees, although both have access to public Jordanian schools. Also, both groups find means into accessing scholarships, whether that be in UNRWA colleges or elsewhere, because of their very limiting economic status. Bear in mind, though, that stateless Palestinians cannot really access scholarships in public universities, but they found other means, like the program of the scholarships for camp residents or scholarships from community development organizations. Another thing both groups did, for an example, is increasing their employability through learning English on YouTube, actually, to be able to compete with others who had better private education. And strikingly, however, stateless Palestinians and participants did not derive these meanings of certainty and order and safety from securing citizenship, as literature and I myself previously assumed. The only form of agency that stateless Palestinians predominantly exercise is using their social networks to find informal jobs to avoid work permits. Another prominent form of agency they exercise in the relational domain, actually, is embedded in their familial and social roles through sacrifices and financial support they provide to their family members. You know, their role as mothers, daughters, sons, sisters, cousins. One of the prominent forms of agency I found that many stateless participants exercise is sacrificing education to work and provide financial support to their families. So the second livelihood strategy is challenging accumulative disadvantage, and which is the outcome of the interrelation between themes of agency in the material and relational well-being domain and the subjective meanings of aspirations and hybrid identities. For stateless participants, they challenge accumulative effects of statelessness and their legal status that deprive them rights in Jordan through meanings of aspirations, you know, like patience, hope, more education, believing in God and their mom's prayers, following their dreams. Whereas for naturalized Palestinian Jordanians, they challenge the accumulative disadvantage of their Palestinian origin, although themselves they are naturalized, because eventually they'll never be native Jordanians, no matter what, through aspirations and hybrid identities deployed to use different belongings and affiliations. And here what I mean by hybrid identities is that they use both Palestinian and Jordanian identities in different situations to get to the goals that they want to get to. One participant actually told me that her family played around their family name to like use just a different letter or something to make it look like a tribal native Jordanian one, for an example. But both groups, however, create meanings of aspirations for a better future to negotiate poverty. And negotiating poverty here is a key word. So what does all this really tell us? It was found that the differences between the two groups are not considerable, but rather elusive. Predominantly, the common forms of agency exercised by both groups are informed by factors such as their socioeconomic status, social networks, familial bonds, education, aspirations, religious beliefs, and so on. Therefore, I proposed in my research that legal status of the stateless participants in this research has only and partly informed their negotiation of employment constraints through one form of agency, which is bypassing governmental processes to obtain the work permit, as I mentioned before. In other words, basically, stateless participants in this research constantly expand and open up new avenues for exercising agency to negotiate constraints such as pursuing education, increasing their employability through skills and competitiveness, building on social capital, creating the will and drive, give meanings to their life despite the limitations of their legal status. Now, to conclude, I conclude with two significant observations. The first one, for stateless youths, the inherited accumulation of decades of de facto integration of their parents and their grandparents before them, along the continuous enhancement of their human and social capital within a framework of a whole lot of constructed meanings that they give to their lives, can possibly allow their agency to influence their life's trajectories despite the limitations of their legal status. This actually reminds us of Bacon's critique of structuration theory and his argument that agency is influenced by structure, but only up to a threshold point where agency becomes independent of the structures that once informed it. Thus, I propose that agency in displacement studies needs to be reconceptualized to reflect the multidirectional processes of choice-making, decision-making, and action-making, because agency in this specific research was constantly evolving and can be exercised interchangeably in different instances and in relation to diverse meanings to achieve different livelihood outcomes. The second observation, and that's the last thing I'll be talking about, is that for these understandings to be useful, we need to understand that bridging between protracted displacement and development is a multifaceted argument. And why? Because we need to understand that, one, solutions in displacement context have to be discussed in avenues beyond the world of naturalization and the three traditional durable solutions. Not everything is about naturalization. And two, that multidisciplinary approach should integrate these processes with other fields of study, like poverty, what I did. Number three is that displacement studies should not avoid naturalizing explanations derived from theory, like structuration theory, for an example. Instead, allow it to strengthen the empirical realities and in-depth individual narratives that we engage with. And finally, that expanding our analytical frameworks has to incorporate intersectionality and intergroups differences. Before I end here, I am by no means trying to say that statelessness does not generate a life filled with challenges and even despair. But what I'm trying to say here is that in this moment, while there is no real and responsive durable solutions undertaken by any state or NGO or the UN itself, maybe instead of maintaining that formal citizenship is the only pathway for these individuals, maybe we should start learning about their own agency-led ones instead. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Lara. So our last presenter is Allan, and Allan is presenting on agency through self-representation of asylum seekers and refugees. Allan's research project aims to reframe what it means to be a refugee, to provide an alternative voice, and hopefully to educate and raise awareness on issues that affect refugees.
Hello, everyone. Just 2 seconds. I need to have my presentation ready. 2 seconds. Okay, hi everyone again. My name is Allan Njanji, and I'm a PhD student at Nottingham Trent University in the United Kingdom. I'm in my second year now, and my practice-led research focuses on how refugees and asylum seekers obtain agency through self-representation. I'm a documentary filmmaker, and also I'm a refugee. And the reason why I wrote this paper is because I'm interested in the plight of refugees and asylum seekers. And I'm advocating for their obtaining agency and a voice so that they can take a lead in the discourse pertaining to their lives. Now, if I can start sharing this. Okay, the call for emblematic figures of refugees, Black people, and indigenous communities for agency and recognition spans the world over. The political agency of the need for refugee self-representation has been revealed to us more cleverly than ever before against the backdrop of a landscape in which political movements designed to give a voice to those marginalized by racial or indigenous otherness have been vilified and pushed to political action. The Black Lives Matter movement and the indigenous rights movement give a model for how refugees can self-advocate for improved rights, inspiring and laying the ground for improved political voice. The newfound energy that has driven these political movements prompt us to think about whether it's time for a refugee rights movement. And we start to see some hint in the drive towards self-representation in films such as 400 Miles of Freedom. However, the difficulty of demonstrating or staging a refugee rights movement makes things like filmmaking or literary representation become more important and empowering mediums in which the activists are protected as people cannot physically reach them. In the current context of the COVID-19 pandemic, the virus' ability to transcend borders or any cultural divide has revealed the cracks within our societies. The effects have skewed against marginalized communities such as refugees, people of color, and indigenous communities through heightened border restrictions and job and income insecurity. Images in the media of fires at Moria refugee camp, fires at Rohingya refugee camp in Bangladesh, millions marching in the Black Lives Matter protests, demonstrating over the death of George Floyd, or the thousands who marched in support of the Wusa indigenous people in Canada.
Sorry, Alan. Sometimes your audio is cutting out, so I don't know if you have like headphones or a microphone, but maybe you're covering it.
No, I don't have headphones now.
Okay, sometimes the audio cuts out.
Is it? It's okay.
Oh,
I think I'll just have to continue. I'm sorry for that.
yeah, we can't seem to hear you.
You cannot hear me.
Okay, that we hear you there. Maybe stay there.
Okay, maybe I just need to be closer to the.
Yeah,
so,
perfect.
I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry for that.
Interrupting. Okay.
Okay. Okay. So I think I said millions marching in the Black Lives Matter movement, protests demonstrating over the death of George Floyd, or the thousands who marched in support of the Wet'suwet'en indigenous people in Canada, signify to opening of new areas of study regarding forms of containment and closures for people who are vilified more on their heritage and identity than anything else. In documentary films, images oscillate between polarities of sentimentalism and realism to represent these communities of refugees, Black or indigenous people. Madeleine Heron argues that affective expectations that refugee stories are dystopic or tragic reduce refugees to objects of pity, whose only subjectivity is victimhood. Sentimentalism thus reinforces the binaries of self versus other, and also largely disallows the potential for ideological critique. Therefore, allowing the refugee to self-represent has the effect of bringing out their real-world experience to the forefront. The pandemic has also exacerbated the xenophobic responses and blame directed on minorities and refugees, not only by the mainstream media, but also by very senior politicians holding high offices. In the United Kingdom, the Prime Minister and the Home Secretary have been on the offensive in castigating lawyers who were acting to support refugees. And more recently, the Home Secretary was quoted as saying she disagreed with the last year's Black Lives Matter protests, as well as taking the knee and branding the protest as dreadful. Such condemnations create a hostile environment, making it difficult for self-representation by refugees. For these three communities, the ground shifts and conditions change, but the same hierarchies remain. Though articulated in new ways, vulnerabilities are exacerbated and solidified. In this pandemic, whilst the subjects might change in terms of directions, motivations, and networks, the echoes of the past still remain. There's still a highly volatile space of violence, political space of asymmetry, and increasingly a space of precarity. These conditions emerge through multiple circuits and modalities, extending transnational or cultural divides. In considering how recognition, agency, and deservingness is afforded to communities, we need to establish where to begin when wanting to grant agency to these maligned people. Whose perspective, whose vantage point is taken, and whether it is a narrative of an individual or group. How are economic, social, and political logics and narratives mobilized, mediated, represented, lived, and how are all these threads entangled? In seeking agency for these communities, what is being considered is the privileging of minoritized voices. In the United Kingdom, a multitude of grassroots projects and initiatives have sprung up dedicated to recording and preserving the memories and histories of different communities, often undervoiced and underrepresented within the mainstream heritage. The impetus for such projects arose from a range of motivations, but in general, all were responding to the desire to document, record, and preserve the identity and history of their own locality and community. It is thus possible to view refugee filmmaking as another form of community archiving, which might be viewed as also articulating a voice of protest that makes them chime with the Black Lives Movement. This lends support to the notion of encouraging self-representation amongst the marginalized communities, fostering development of their own narratives based on lived experiences, and having these disseminated and archived for posterity. In granting agency to refugees, being able to hear personal narratives and observe refugee lives clearly offers subjects a greater say in the construction of their image. It represents a major shift in attitude about where one looks for authority and authenticity. Portraying refugees as straightforward victims removes political agency from the figure of the refugee by establishing a condition of political voicelessness. Lisa Malky advances the idea that voice is the ability to establish narrative authority over one's own circumstances and future, and also the ability to claim an audience. This paper evaluates the granting of agency to refugees and asylum seekers through self-representative documentary filmmaking directorship. Exploring ways in which refugees can be granted agency, Lily Choliaraki, who, for instance, suggests that migrant self-representation might facilitate recognition, remediation, performance, and celebration of migrants themselves in a way that counteracts moral regulation. This self-representation is further supported by J. Ruby, who comments in the Visual Anthropology, arguing that for some observers, indigenous media is a positive step towards self-determination. She contends that it offers possible means, social as well as political, for reproducing and transforming cultural identity for people who have experienced massive political, geographic, and economic disruption. These disruptions are a common feature in the lives of refugees and indigenous communities, and having the capacity to dictate the narrative and lead discourse on their lives serves to help them reclaim agency and deservingness. The documentary film 400 Miles of Freedom, which was produced in 2012, self-directed by Avishai McKinnon, who is a refugee, is an autobiographical film that tells the story of his family's journey as they fled religious persecution from Ethiopia on their way to Israel via Sudanese refugee camps. This gives him total authorial control over the creation of both the recorded and broadcast content of the film, and means that as the sole filmmaker, he has the ability to address a particular idea through his film without having to consult with any other party. This position can be read as a form of indigenous media, defined by Pamela Wilson and Michelle Stewart as work made by those within the communities that are documented, and which often directly addresses the politics of identity and representation by engaging and challenging the dominant political forms. They contend that control of media representation and of cultural self-definition assets and signifies cultural and political sovereignty itself. This is particularly relevant to Avishai, who has autonomous control in how he represents the figure of the refugee. Malky argues that there is a tendency to universalize the refugee as a special kind of person, not only in the textual representation, but also in their photographic representation. These photographic representations will be based on preconceived notions that dehumanize refugees and frequently objectify them whilst dismissing their historical, cultural, and political circumstances. J. Ruby also argues that for some observers, indigenous media is a positive step towards self-determination, as it offers a possible means, social as well as political, for reproducing and transforming cultural identity for people who have experienced massive political, geographic, and economic disruption. Social actors who have the capacity and capability to create media outputs can play a significant role in redefining discourse on refugees. When refugees have access to video camera equipment, they are not bound by anyone or any institution as to the type of content they can create. They can use this opportunity to create content that speaks about them, celebrates their identity, values, and culture. This self-representation accords Avishai the right to maintain his identity, regardless of the country that he finds himself living in. As a refugee, he falls in the category of marginalized groups and experiences, who have thus claimed their space among autobiographical narratives. In conclusion, through self-representation, members of these communities, be they refugees, Black people, and Indigenous people, are able to showcase their own religion, history, and identities by circumventing the dominant structures of mainstream media. Colin Harvey argues that perhaps it is time to consider the advantages of perpetual critical irritants when referring to dissident voices in our discourse. For this reason, voices such as that of Avishai should be encouraged, if not promoted, so that the marginalized, be they Black, Indigenous communities, or refugees, will be afforded agency to determine their own lives and see themselves as deserving citizens who have the same rights as every ordinary citizen. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Allan, and to all of our panelists. Those were excellent presentations. So now we'll have a Q&A session. So if you have any questions, please feel free to write it in the chat or use the raise hand function, and we can ask our panelists. So to start off, I'll get the ball rolling with a question. It's for Souhail. You had mentioned that in your recommendations that you would, that there should be some newcomer programs. And so I know that there are a few, and I was just wondering if you can expand on what maybe they lack and how they can be improved.
Thank you, Laura. I think there is no need for to say that there are programs available. We know that settlement services have a range of programs that are there to help the resettlement, in particular for the influx of Syrian refugees. Based on my research, the participants and their agency shows us that each individual have different experience and different expectations. And we cannot look at them as a group. For example, we cannot say these are government assisted refugees. They need to go through level 1 and level 2 and level 3 until they finish there. Maybe they do not want, maybe they have that level already. Maybe they want to explore different venues. What I noticed the most is there wasn't any information about available programs that can help them engage within the employment services. For example, credentials programs, or for example, tailored English technical abilities, for example, just so that they can learn the language of business, of doing business, for example, or learn the technical language that they need to use based on their personal skills. And some of them, especially one participant, was able to overcome this barrier. It took him 3 years, and his advice, or his advice to us was that we should not look at refugees from a status point of view. We should look at them based on individual basis and the individual needs, and increase maybe this collaboration between universities, colleges, and settlement services that can allow them access education quicker than they have now.
Great, thank you. Does anyone else have a question? Brianna?
Yeah, thank you so much to all three presenters. Some really good work that you guys shared with us today. My question is for Lara and Allan. I kind of see some like overlapping maybe conversations, and I was wondering what your take on it would be. So Lara, you kind of spoke about how maybe the assumption that naturalization is the end all be all for expressions of agency, you know, is not necessarily the case. And then also Allan, kind of the idea of the perpetual image that seems to be imposed on refugees as in this like circle or state of constant victimhood. So I was wondering if you guys, whoever would like to start first, could maybe speak to is there a relationship between, I guess, that imposition of victimhood and also the privileging of status, maybe in the relationship between those two assumptions.
Okay, I can start. It's true that as long as one is a refugee, you are in perpetuity in a state of precarity, especially being someone who is living it, because like I said, I'm still a refugee. And the fact that no matter where you go, you always carry that label. You know, you're always labeled. If you're lucky, you'll be lucky if you're being referred to as a refugee. I've had instances where I've been referred to as an asylum seeker now with papers. So it seems as if it's a bit difficult to become a normal citizen in a country that you don't belong in. And again, I suppose that opens up a question of belonging, you know, in terms of a space, where do we all belong? So yes, as a refugee, we're always grappling with that fact of being a refugee in perpetuity. And I remember speaking to one of my supervisors, and I see that she has actually joined, At what stage does one stop being a refugee? Is it when they become a citizen? But then what is a citizenship paper? Because if my family is still back home, I mean, or maybe at what stage does one become an immigrant and stop being a refugee? You know, as far as I'm concerned, as long as you've just claimed asylum and you are not in your home country, no matter if you live for 300 years, you'll always be a refugee, unfortunately. That's what I can say here. Lara.
Thank you for this, Allan. I think I'll build up on what you were saying. And this is why I always insist that contextualizing the question in hand is so important. Because if I look at my case, for an example, the Palestinian participants back in Jordan, these are 5th and 6th generations of so-called refugees. And this is when, to them, refugee actually means nothing. And when I used to ask about the question of belonging, to them, Palestine is just an idea of what their ancestors belonged to one time. So the question remains to me, and this is what I plan to take forward in my own research, is what are we talking about here? Is it informal citizenship or formal citizenship? Is it a piece of paper, or is it just a practice of belonging in a space, whether emotionally or actually practicing that citizenship in your daily lives and planning for the future with certain meanings that connect you to that specific place in time? And I guess time to me is always a very crucial question when it comes to displacement issues. I can argue that would be the same for people and refugees who themselves have experienced displacement or themselves have seen their parents being displaced. So again, 5th and 6th generation, that's a completely different issue. I would argue soon enough, we're going to be talking about these same issues when it comes to the Syrian refugees. The conflict has been there for 10 years now. So what's going on with these coming generations? What happens when that story of displacement, I don't want to say disappear, but loses its impact and loses its power in their narrations? Then what happens? Is that the moment where we talk about citizenship in the formal sense? Or is it citizenship a practice, a form of practice that they really go about without really caring about what kind of legal status they have carrying their whole lives?
Thank you. Those are, yeah, it just brings up so many thoughts that I have, but I just want to get to some of the questions in the chat. So Souhail asked Lara, how combined state-led interest and global governance agencies recommendations help normalize the status quo of refugees?
I think I would use the term neutralize rather than normalize, I think. And it's that's a really important question. It's, in the sense, it's a neutralizing and it has two ends. One of them is, what can we offer for these refugees to actually have a decent life? And this is where issues a lot, around political questions come into the picture. But the other end of it as well is a matter of the question of integrity, and what does that mean when you're intervening and not, and do these refugees themselves want others to intervene in their lives? So I always find that also tricky, like, when do we withdraw and think that they don't need intervention, and when other times we feel that they actually need it? And I could relate to so many of the participants I engaged with. So many of these actually get scholarships, get assistantship, get so many things, and so many are provided by so many, these avenues of accessing informal rights in a way from these very mundane interventions, whether it's a community-based intervention or whatever. So I don't have an answer, but one thing that I know is the current status quo is not the right way to be approaching this. This I know for a fact. And until we reshape that perspective, we are still focusing on one end only. And maybe what it's required is just a combination of all these different questions and different game players, let's say, to be on the table discussing all these matters, as long as these people, by the end of the day, carry on their refugee status in a sense.
Thank you. So I apologize if I mispronounced the name. Kahina is asking, hi all, these were great presentations. Thank you so much for Allan, but also welcoming all presenters' opinions on this. What kind of self-representation strategies could be harnessed when migration is addressed in mainstream media?
Okay, that's a brilliant question. The one thing that many organizations are engaging at the moment here in UK is empowering refugees to take leadership of projects. That is one simple one that many people do. I'm part of an organization called Refugee Week, and we try by all means to bring as many refugees as possible to come out of their shells. Because remember, by the very fact that they are refugees, in most cases they'll be shy. So we want to bring them out to initiate projects which they can lead on, be they projects in art, be they projects in craft, be they projects in poetry, or even in writing, as long as people are given that platform to express themselves. I think even in cooking, we've got a project where the refugee women do the cooking. It is that self-expression that they exhibit, which is really needed. Because at the moment, what we do not want is just for the mainstream media to be dictating the discourse on the narrative of refugees and asylum seekers. So giving that right, or maybe not giving, because I think giving is the wrong word. I think a refugee and asylum seeker should take that right, should obtain that right to be able to tell their stories. And they can say it in so many ways. Like I said, it could be in arts, in craft, and in literature. Having that platform to be able to express not only my capabilities, but my culture, my history, my heritage, that is definitely a way forward in, that's one way of harnessing the self-representation of us refugees. I hope that answers the question.
I would add to Allan's point, which is a great point. I guess so far, our status quo is that mainstream media is very much, influenced by political discourse. And the political discourse right now in this moment is very much fixated on the idea of the deserving and the undeserving. So I guess no matter how much we try and go around this and try to bring in the voice of refugees themselves, there's always that question of, is it even a deserving voice or an undeserving voice? And it's usually the same group of refugees coming from the same part of the world that themselves being subjected to this criteria of deserving, non-deserving. So, and then this is where the paradox is, because now the question is about personal stories that make you either deserving or not. But then at the same time, these personal voices are not being represented. So it's by the end of the day, that's the political discourse that is being manifested in all these things.
Souhail, did you want to comment, or do you want to move to the next question?
We can move ahead. I think
okay. So the next questions are for you. Can you please specify the older refugee group for the specific study? Did you have any specific age group in mind? And the second question is, how did you recruit JAR refugee participants specifically?
Yes. That is a very good question. Thank you. It is also a limitation of the study. The age, I focused on 55 years old and higher, just because I wanted to catch some of them within their employment years, so I can discuss that. In terms of the recruitment, it did happen based on my employment history. I worked for the urban ministries in Hamilton, and the urban ministries provide settlement services for refugees and newcomers. My issue was to find the guards specifically. Was that even though I found here in Toronto Syrian refugees from the other programs, in particular the privately sponsored program, I had a lot of difficulties finding government-assisted refugees. Also, when I found some, I had difficulties convincing them to participate. And that was because they were also aware of how the research can portray them in the future and how that may impact their image in the future. I had to go through a proper channel of recruiting by going through Hamilton Urban Ministries, through a specific settlement program that took care of older adults. Through that channel, I was able to recruit 2 participants, and then using snowballing to recruit the rest.
Great, thank you. So I think that is all of the questions that were posted in the chat. Does anyone have any last minute thoughts or
I just want to add one more question, please, for Lara and Allan. I just to add to my question before for Lara. One of the research I did before was on undocumented migrants and how the waiting period impacts their identities. My research focused on South-North relationships. So migrants maybe in South Spain, maybe between Spain and maybe between in Calais, between France and the UK. In your opinion, because this is more of a South-South relationship and within the same region, same country, probably same ethnicity and same religion, how did you find that the waiting period and how did it impact their identities in the long term?
Okay, I can go first. Yeah, now talking from a UK perspective, first of all, that's one of the toughest ones because the application to get legal status is just horrendous in UK. So when someone doesn't even have any documentation, any papers, it's doubly so. In terms of how it affects the identification, I think they will all just fall in the group of asylum seekers. And we know that this is treated by the UK government, especially, as the lowest of the low. You know, it is quite harrowing because I also volunteer for some organizations which try to help asylum seekers to make applications for their status. It is harrowing when we see undocumented persons, be they young people or be they old people, try to go through the very first stage of what is called the main interviews. So first of all, many people end up being given just the same the date of birth. I've seen so many people, especially from Africa, their date of birth will always be, say, the 1st of January. And you wonder, how can all of these people just have one particular date of birth? I've even had issues where Home Office officials have said, okay, you are a Muslim, okay, we'll just call you Muhammad. And then that will stick with them for the rest of their lives within UK. So it has adverse effects terribly, you know, when it comes to undocumented persons. And I say, you know, I'll always be hammering this, that for one to be an asylum seeker, especially within the Western diaspora, is one of the worst things that one could ever be. I hope that helps in any way.
I guess, Souhail, the context, the Jordanian context is very specific in this matter because, well, first of all, Jordan right now is hosting so many refugee groups, like you name it, and each one of them has a specific, I would argue, like a bureaucratic structure of addressing these issues. But let's talk about the Palestinian instance particularly. It's very complex again, because let's just remember that Jordan was part of that war that has led to that displacement. So there was a sense of responsibility at that time to try and bring in these people and at least provide with alternatives. But Allan, you just made me smile because, yeah, exactly the same thing for Palestinians. They all have the same date of birth, but yet at least the ones that, so this is the hierarchy of even you know, classifying different groups. The ones that arrived in the 1948 were automatically naturalized. You don't have to present anything other than the fact that you have one birth date, and then by default, you're actually naturalized and you remain to be Jordanian until this moment. When it later on, so many different political changes have shifted that structure into something else. And this is why now there are a lot of groups of Palestinians. Some are stateless, others are naturalized, like I said, others have a specific type of access to a certain thing. You know, they call it the green card, the blue card, the yellow card. And it's like a whole spectrum of, you know, different groups of Palestinians living under one state, you know, being treated differently. And the funny things about stateless Palestinians specifically is that they have the legal status of Arab foreigners. So by default, somehow it's supposed to give them access to a certain type of rights, but yet at the same time, it's depriving them from so other means of actually claiming their refugeness through this mean and actually get, you know, proper assistance from somewhere. So it's very complex, but I tried to brief it up in like a minute or so.
Thank you so much. It's very complex for sure. So there's one last question and then I think we'll wrap it up. So if you self-identify as migrants, how do you negotiate your positionality in your research process and especially in relation to other self-identified migrants?
I'll start again. Yeah. Well, I regard myself as a refugee, not a migrant. And with regards to my research, it's actually autobiographical. So I am interviewing other refugees and asylum seekers, but I'm also including part of the life that I've lived here as a refugee and an asylum seeker into my research. And I think it actually adds weight. It adds weight to my research, because essentially I know what I'm talking about. That's a base, you know. And then having that experience and then realizing that other people have also been able to live, you know, through the dangers, through the struggles that I've gone through, I think it adds positively to my cause.
I don't think I can top up this answer, so I'll just leave it at you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Allan. I don't. Here is my response, and thank you for the question. I found it very interesting. I do not identify as an immigrant. Maybe you can see me, and then maybe we can cite Fanon here, you know, and say, you know, it's the little girl that see me as an immigrant, not me. I'm just a citizen of the world, and this is just one step in the journey. More specifically for international students or like bilingual students here in Canada, because I started my experience in Switzerland, and I worked as a chemist there for about 10 years before I get interested into this idea of policy studies and immigration, basically once I came in here to Canada. So I don't, yes, I do not specifically self-identify as immigrants, and I acknowledge that in my research, because we all come from different places, but we have also different experiences, and the label of immigrants, of refugees, should not be the first one to flag, I think. So yeah, I think that's my answer.
If I have a few seconds, I'll just add something to this. I think I myself don't self-identify as migrant, although I am, but I think my participants did more than I did, actually. And there was that power dynamic that I had to manage and embrace at some point, you know, because you left that part of the world and now you're coming back and asking these questions about lives that we have to put up with for our whole lives. So there was that notion of power related and very much intertwined with the idea of like, I left that part of the world for a better world. I put these in two different codes, but yeah, I think they've seen me and perceived me as being this more than I see or perceive myself as being one.
Thank you so much. And thank you to all of our attendees and our panelists for being here. This was a wonderful discussion, and I hope everyone enjoyed the presentations as well. We are now going to be having a quick break from 1:15 to 1:30, and at 1:30 there will be a roundtable panel discussion on re-embodying and mobilizing Indigenous health and medicine. Thank you again, and I hope you all have a great rest of the conference.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.